Welcome everyone. Once again, this is Biltor Uluçay from RestartLab. I call myself the curious RestartLabber. Thanks for your interest and being here with us this evening. It's evening time. This is Istanbul, Turkey. Okay, and I hope everyone's doing fine. We hope that you'll enjoy today's session and be a part of this exciting journey. Before moving on to the session and introducing our guest speaker, Thomison, I want to provide some brief information about our organization, RestartLab. So we originally founded as a cross-industry think tank initiative, now transforming into a DAO, a decentralized autonomous organization. Simple to say, we are focusing in questioning the work, the traditional work, and which we are used to today. And this includes, our focus includes redefining the work concept for the benefits of larger communities, supporting the presence of individuals and enabling self-actualization of themselves, thus lighting the path of organizations for alternative models to create a more autonomous way of working to deliver more value both for business and the world. And today, we all know that there are organizations around the world from many different industries which consist of self-managing teams. They all aim to be more human-centric and continue to succeed with their happy and committed employees. This is very important to us. So we believe that sharing these experiences in this geography, in our geography, will inspire us too. As part of this spectacular evolution journey, we have organized tonight's RestartLab event to get the reflections of such an enlightenment from a seasoned entrepreneur and an enterprise builder. And I'm pleased to introduce our guest, Thomison.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. Boy, I really identify and resonate with RestartLab's purpose. That is so cool. It really hits home. And really also identify with your sense of curiosity. It's really the thing that has driven me almost my entire life, I might even say. Just curious about everything. Insatiable curiosity has led me into some really interesting places, for sure. And just want to thank you for inviting me, Matt. Thank you for reaching out initially. Biltor, is it correct? Biltor? Yes?
Perfect.
Cool. Thank you for hosting today. My understanding is we want to explore these territories that were just described, new ways of working, decentralization, decentralized autonomous organizations, kind of dip our toes into these waters. And I'm happy to do that with you today. I also understand that some of you are new to this subject, completely new. Others are coming at it from maybe other practices like lean or agile software development practices. I see a few of you on my screen, maybe the folks that you don't know who I'm seeing, but folks having lean or agile software development background. If you can just kind of give me a wave of a hand, I'll know a little bit about who's in the audience. Not a requirement by any stretch, but I can tie some things in if I see that opportunity. So I understand the format is me speaking a bit. That won't be a problem. So I can go about 15 or 20 minutes-ish. I don't want to bore you with a bunch of history, but I do want to introduce the topic and maybe trigger some questions. In my vernacular, we sometimes call them tensions, and we mean that in the most positive way possible. It's like we sparked some curiosity. What does he mean by that? Could he possibly mean what he's saying? I have a tension, or I have a question, or I have something that I'm curious about. So that's kind of what I'd like to do, is maybe trigger some curiosities or questions that we can dig into for the remainder of our time together. So I'll tell this story by way of a journey. I started out as an entrepreneur almost from the beginning. I've had this almost insatiable itch to scratch, curious about a lot of things. I did study in university. I studied a lot of things. That curiosity got me in trouble because I spent 5 years studying and never actually got to a degree. But I learned a lot. And in that time, I launched my first company. And my first company was in technology. Actually, I was doing software development and learning about this new thing in the world at the time, computers that were accessible by everybody, that was changing how we communicate and how we work. So I wanted in. And so I started actually my career in developing software and working with networks and communication. And that led me on a long path of seeing technology as a great enabler. It's changing everything, obviously, and it has over the last 20, 30 years, right? So for me, I started that way in a few tech companies, and then that led to bigger tech companies, and then learning how to run those companies as a business, which introduced me to the idea of how do we run a business? What are organizing principles? How do we improve our experience in the work environment? And I spent about 20 years playing the business improvement game, trying to figure out how to make things better where we work. And I had all the classic things done to me, like business process improvement, total quality management back in the day, lean and agile systems, all the clever techniques that we try to use to improve our work life. I was learning about those as they were being delivered in companies I was working with. And then ultimately, I became that management consultant, trying to deliver them to others, trying to improve the work life that we experience in corporations. And time again, I would have my butt handed to me. We would try all kinds of grand change initiatives, all kinds of incremental improvements of promise, whether it be high performance teams or the lean and agile systems that I mentioned. And we'd get everybody excited about them. And there would be absolutely value embedded in these techniques for sure. But what would happen in my experience, we would come right back into the same work structures. We'd come right back into the same management structures. And we'd come right back into the same power system. And I especially saw this in the agile development software space, because agile has some really cool elements to it, really important elements in the decentralized self-organization space. And there's this idea, especially with tech teams and software development teams, if we could only get the rest of the organization, if we could only get everybody else to see what we see on running the organization with these principles, like the Agile Manifesto. And there was a lot of initiatives trying to get agile for everybody, right? Agile across the organization. But most of those projects failed too for the same reason. And that reason was there was a power system at play that always won the day, that always trumped, that always was operating whether we wanted it to or not. So this management hierarchy system, this power hierarchy of a top and a bottom, and decisions made either implicitly or explicitly sometimes, but personally by a manager who could change her or his mind at a moment's notice. And then there was this weird sort of thing going on about optimizing relationships, like employee engagement and professional development and leadership development, where we were trying to optimize our relationships for commercial gain. That seems so weird now. And all of these activities were going on in organizations. And as I said, I tried many times to be successful with these old paradigms. And I had my butt handed to me. We failed over and over again until at one point in the mid 2000s, I really got tired, burnt out, maybe cynical for sure. And I was about ready to give up. I was kind of broken to the point where I was ready to look at and try other things. And that's when I crossed paths with my future business partner, Brian Robertson, who was experimenting with new ways of thinking about organizing in his software company and incorporating agile principles. And so we crossed paths in 2003, 2006 and launched Holacracy 1 in 2007. So in 2007, I made my big break. I was done with incremental improvements, and I was done with management hierarchy. And I mean that for real. So for 15 years, I've worked in systems that have been self-organized, self-organizing systems. And Holacracy 1 played and still plays a major part in that. In that for the first few years, we were continuing to experiment on the rule set, and rule sets will be important for the last part of my discussion here. We were experimenting with the rule set that could adequately replace management hierarchy. And so we launched the company in 2007, and over the course of now 15 years, Holacracy has been the gold standard, really. There are a lot of other practices for sure, but I would claim Holacracy, my bias is showing, of course, that Holacracy is the gold standard as the management hierarchy replacement. And one thing it does, it replaces that hierarchy completely. So folks on this call who know me well know I'm very fond of saying Holacracy is a complete wholesale replacement for management hierarchy. And I mean every word, period. There are no bosses, there are no C-suites, there are no people managing people. Everybody's playing by the same set of rules. It is a rules-based approach to power. And there is a power holder that surrenders her or his power into a constitutional rule set, a set of rules that we all play by. And so this is a huge leap. This finally addressed the underlying issue of the power system trumping all of the good techniques that we were coming up with in the world. And so for the last, like I said, 15 years, I've had the luxury, really, the privilege of leading a lot of the early Holacracy deployments with leading entrepreneurs and business leaders and innovators who are also kind of fed up with the status quo. And Holacracy certainly wasn't the first. This is a trend, right, that's been around for decades. We can trace this back to the 70s and 80s with Simcoe and Sociocracy and many, many others, Morningstar. You've probably read much of the literature. So this is a trend. The trend is to self-organize. It's the 21st century after all, damn it. It's time for us to rethink how we coordinate effort to get work done. And since we have these tools, we can now contemplate getting work done without a boss, without a management hierarchy, where purpose is the new boss, where purpose is the new attractor. So everything hangs on purpose. And I love this. And this will be important too, as we talk about the rest of the story as we get into DAOs and such. So purpose is the anchor for a self-organizing system. One of my favorite authors and thought leaders in this space is Tim Kelly. He's the founder of True Purpose Institute and author of the book, True Purpose. And he says, you know, purpose is kind of optional in standard hierarchical structures, but a requirement in a self-organized system. So purpose is king, purpose is boss, if you will. And everybody serves purpose. And I mean everybody, because there are no privileged people in this system. We're all just independent agents working to express purpose in the world, which is really kind of cool. So I was able to do that for a number of years, lead these and learn how real entrepreneurs, real business leaders acclimated to a self-organized system. And it's a tough journey. And I know many of you on this call that are in my professional network have been on this journey, helping organizations make the power shift, shifting the power to a set of rules, and then inviting everybody to play by the same set of rules, which is really difficult. There's a lot to unlearn and a lot to learn, but there's also a lot of value in the effort. The benefit and the outcome is well worth it in my experience. In other words, I am never going back, ever. So around 2013 or so, being the entrepreneur that I am and having some great success with Holacracy 1 now in the world with 1,000 organizations, tens of thousands of people, software to support the practice, a book out, I was starting to get my entrepreneurial itch again. and looking at, well, we've done a really good job of replacing management hierarchy as a power structure, but what about where power lives elsewhere in systems? So holacracy doesn't address the legal and capital structures. We still have limiteds and limited liability companies and GmbHs in Germany, or KGs, or co-ops, or all of that stuff. And those rules haven't been updated in like forever. And now that we've gotten rid of the bosses notion, what are we still doing with employees? Why is that still a thing? So I got curious again, what could we do about that? And we launched with two other founding members, one who's on the call here with me today, a company, an enterprise by the name of Encode.org, to rewrite the rules of the legal and capital structures and the labor structures, to create a social agreement for people, to be compatible with the operational agreement that is the Holacracy Constitution, and a new set of rules for the legal and capital structures. And so this has been the work of Encode over the last 6 years now, launching in 2015, 7 years, 2022, and rewriting the legal code in various jurisdictions. So not to get too caught up in the details there, but as a leaping off point for where it gets even more juicy, I think, and brings us to the actual topic of our webinar today. And so just to add another ingredient to this mix, in the 2013 timeframe, I started to get curious about blockchain and cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin, and started to dip my toe in that water, now 8 years ago. So I remember buying my first Bitcoin at an amazing price of, I think, like 300 US, yay. And playing with the different protocols as they evolved, and then riding the roller coaster ride, vomiting when everything broke, and collapsed. And so I've had my eye on blockchain and crypto for quite some time. And the rules that we have written are interesting in that they can now serve as code, if you will, for what's emerging in the decentralized autonomous organization space. So the topic of this webinar was self-organization plus governance meets blockchain. And to me, that's how I think about DAOs. So decentralized autonomous organizations are these strange creatures that are just kind of emerging in the world, that they live differently and they behave differently in one regard, but they also look very similar to me in another. In other words, they are rules-based, the smart contract. So the smart contract governs the interaction, it governs the treasury or the money, and it does something else that most classic organizations don't do very well. It structures decision-making or governance. And so this is really an interesting move, right? And this is what's gotten a lot of people's attention. We can now have these, quote, trustless systems where we can connect our wallets to a contract and participate in a structure to express some work into the world. And we can do so without bosses, without intermediating parties, and we can equally participate in the coordinating of that effort. This might sound a little bit familiar to my story, right? So that's the good news. We're now using technology. I don't know if folks have read Laloux's book, Frederick's book, Reinventing Organization. It's kind of a seminal work in this space. And he paints a beautiful picture of the evolutionary trajectory of organizations, how this is just an ongoing evolutionary march towards greater and greater embrace of things that we care about. And I just see DAOs as the next evolutionary step. And so for me, what we're doing at Encode is we're full on shifting our focus. Our strategy actually is now to take the rules, the code that we have created, and port it to smart contracts that live on the blockchain, that allow us to do good governance, that allow us to structure the capital and profit interests in a way that obeys self-organizing principles, that bridges between mature 21st century governance, which I can talk about, and blockchain governance, which is immature and doesn't scale very well for more complex organizational needs. And so this is kind of what we are now wrestling with, is how to integrate these two worlds, the self-organization world and the blockchain world, and create a more robust offering for folks that want to decentralize their work for purposes and invite everybody to play on an equal playing field. And so we call this the PowerShiftDAO, where these PowerShift principles are baked into everything. Our social fabric, our organization operating system, and the legal and capital structures. And so that's what I mean when I say self-organization and governance meets blockchain. And that's how I think about DAOs, as a much more robust offering. And with that, I will kind of bring my wide-ranging shotgun approach to a close and see what tensions I might have triggered, what questions might have come up, what curiosities you might have as this intersects with your own work. And happy to dig into any questions that come up.
Thank you very much, Tom. So everyone, you can write your questions through Slido, where on the chat you can find the address for the Slido. Now I'm checking the Slido, the questions that we have. So Tom, one question is from Brock, and it is that why we cannot see so much real-world examples of DAOs except crypto world. What does DAOs missing?
Yeah, they're missing a lot, quite frankly. They show a lot of promise, but it's like when people got excited about the internet circa 1990s, late 90s. There was a lot of promise, but not a lot of sophistication. It's the same with the DAOs. We have an intuition. The reason that people are excited, there's an intuition that this is a game changer, and I think that it is. But it is very unsophisticated on how it handles really easy business issues. It doesn't do decision-making very well because it relies on some old school thinking about ownership. So DAOs are really good at managing the treasury, or the tokens. And the treasury are the coin of the realm. It's the monetary resource of the DAO. And decisions about how monies are spent is at one point, in one way, egalitarian. Everybody gets to decide, but that's also the very downside. Everybody gets to decide. What? How are you possibly going to scale an organization where everybody gets to decide on everything, right? Self-organization doesn't work that way, right? We don't work that way as a complex system. And worse, the decision-making protocols are typically based on ownership. In other words, you vote your shares, which pulls us all the way back to a bad pattern of capitalistic notions, where you can use your influence, your power personally, by voting your capital interests, or the number of tokens you hold, to sway a vote. This is not serving purpose. This is serving your personal holdings and interests, right? And this is a really lousy way to self-organize. And there aren't a lot of good options yet in this space, but they're beginning to emerge. So this is beginning to be a known issue, known problem, known solutions coming, right, to address the decision-making mechanics within DAOs, so that they are more able to address broader business problems than some of the simple things that we see now today. And then the other thing that's plaguing DAOs, and I talked about this with one of my partners in crime, Gil Schoten, who has worked for a DAO, and we were talking about the opportunities and challenges of DAO. DAOs in particular. And one of the issues that are that's coming up is if a DAO becomes successful, it's like, oh my God, now what? Because we have all these equal members participating in a structure, and we might be even generating some interesting turnover or revenue, but we're also generating some liability in the world by doing some things, but we have no legitimacy. Most of these DAOs are not anchored in any legal jurisdiction. It's only very recently that jurisdictions are recognizing these structures as legally legitimate. And so for us, for Encode, we have just shifted to one of those jurisdictions in the US that has fully recognized a DAO, and we've reincorporated there so that we can begin to deploy decision-making contracts, smart contracts, to algorithmically run the enterprise as a legitimate DAO, legally anchored. And so what happens if you don't have that? Every person that's connected to their wallet is legally liable. There's no limits of liability. It's just an open partnership. And so if anything goes wrong, everyone's jointly and severally liable because there's no insulation, right? And so legitimacy, I think, is going to be a key element in making DAOs more mature and being able to embrace broader business problems. Let's say broader business projects, and in my vernacular, purposes that we care about. So in my world, I see DAOs as seeded with a purpose. And then that purpose draws people to it. And then people connect their contract to that purpose. And then the rules self-organize and coordinate effort to express that purpose or work into the world. But we're on a path to get there. We aren't there now.
Okay, thanks, Tom. So another question is, how can one organization shift to a DAO? What key success factors needed to be successful in this shift?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the lucky thing is we have been, when I say we, Encode.org has been living into that answer now for about 5 or 6 years. So that structure that I described to you, where all the rules have been upgraded, the social rules, the operational rules, and the legal and financial rules, that's a compound structure that we've called a for-purpose enterprise, where everything's for purpose. And all the rule sets are now encoded with these principles of self-organization, where everything hangs on purpose. There's an organic, non-pyramidal style structure. There's a deep sense of cultivating awareness in the form of agility and responsiveness and lean and just in time and now next kind of thinking, right? There's a high degree of visibility or transparency in the system and a high degree of agency. These 5 markers constitute a power-shifted system. And so, long way around to get to the answer. If you want to shift your current organization, you need to start thinking about the fundamentals. How is the organization structured operationally? Is it using a rule set to get work done? Has it embraced self-organization like holacracy or sociocracy or teal practices or any of the number of other ways of addressing self-organization? Have you started to address the legal and capital structures so that you don't have boards, officers, directors, voting rights, where you're voting your capital interests and exerting power personally? If you're showing up in a system that no longer requires employees, then what's the container for us as humans to show up in? Where do we get our social connection, our supporting of one another? So if an organization is looking to become a DAO, I would claim that Encode, way back in 2015, was a DAO. It was fully decentralized. It had agency and autonomy, and it was a complete organization or enterprise to address a particular purpose. It just wasn't on chain. So I would invite you to think about DAOs more broadly. think about it from a decentralization standpoint. And there's a lot of ways to decentralize. And the precursor to blockchain are all the things that I just mentioned, where we've rewritten the rules across the three main areas that any enterprise needs to express its purpose: capital, operations, and people. Those three things need to be upgraded, right? The rules need to be upgraded so that they're compatible with the PowerShift principles that I just mentioned and self-organization principles. So if you're interested in shifting, then depending on where you are in that journey, you might start looking at self-organizing systems like sociocracy, holacracy, teal, or maybe you're already there and you start looking at, how are we legally structured? And what do we think about these owners? And what is our capital structure? And then start experimenting with working as non-employees, because that's exactly what you'll be when you connect your wallet as a DAO to a DAO. You will be a non-employee. And what does that feel like? And what are the ramifications of that?
Thank you very much. So about these models, FP and other things you mentioned, I understand that from your website, encode.org, more information can be gathered through connecting to you. This is what I have seen so far. Am I correct?
Yes. So encode.org's purpose is to connect power, purpose, and work, and to bring these self-organized systems more fully to the world. The way I languaged that when Christiane Suschweiler, who's on the call, and another gentleman by the name of Peter Kessel, the founding members of ENCODE, was to push the boundaries. So ENCODE has been all about, for the last many years, pushing the boundaries of self-organization to the end point. So if you're curious about how to encode new rules in the legal and capital structure, encode.org is a place to go learn. If you're curious about what it means to show up as an independent agent, not as an employee, an independent agent of purpose, encode.org is a place to go to for people who have lived into that system for a number of years. So that is ENCODE's purpose, is to figure out by living into these systems and failing over and over and over again on what works and what doesn't, to distill out a set of rules and practices that can work and be deployed and scaled.
So, Tom, I remember that you have defined yourself as an experimentalist. This is one of the reasons why.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. So there's one question from Gert. You have already mentioned lots of things, but he, asked a couple of minutes ago specifically what capabilities, functions would you build into a DAO for holacracy? Would you like to add more to what you have mentioned so far?
Yeah, sure. So we have a few, maybe several holacracy practitioners, even coaches or master coaches, I think, on the call. Yay. There's a lot of ways of describing holacracy for sure. I gave you one, a complete wholesale replacement for management hierarchy. That's one. But it's many things. It's a operational system to coordinate effort to get work done. That's one. But it's also a decision-making tool, governance. And this is where it's relevant. So one of the real gifts, I think, that holacracy gave the business world is to put emphasis on explicit decision-making processes. This is kind of key. And this is what bridges over to blockchain ultimately. But now we have, at least with holacracy and sociocracy, which predates holacracy, years, decade and a half for holacracy, 15 years of experience running very sophisticated organizations, billion-dollar turnover organizations, right? Subsidiary of public company organizations, multi-thousand employee organizations, using holacracy's decision-making tools. And it calls its governance integrative decision-making, which is a departure from what we're used to. It departs from either a choice between two bad choices, really. Consensus seeking, which is, as all of us know, can be maddening, right? consensus-seeking hell, as it's sometimes referred to, trying to get others to buy into your idea or decision. Or the other extreme is autocratic decision-making by maybe a not very enlightened or progressive or even kind leader or decision maker. And this can lead to all sorts of unwanted outcomes. So holacracy bridged those two poles, if you will, consensus and autocracy. So there's a better way, there's another way. There's a way to integrate perspectives of those people that care about the work in a local container or local group, and integrate the minimally sufficient perspectives. That should be a good, lean, and agile term. The minimum amount of perspectives needed to make the fastest decision possible to move us forward and not backwards. It should sound very agile and lean, because it is, right? But it's systematized, and it's a practice that everybody plays at every level of scale in the organization. Remember I said back in the day, you know, especially folks championing agile systems, recognizing the value of what I just described, wanted to bring it to the whole organization, right? Agile for everybody, agile for the whole organization. But it was really hard because agile had a manifesto and a set of practices, but not a written down rule set for decision making. And that's what holacracy's constitution is a written down rule set for coordinating effort. And so holacracy brings a different way of deciding, integrating perspectives, and a scalable way of doing that across the entirety of the organization. Everybody does the same thing when it comes together to decide. So it's the decision-making. When I say 21st century decision-making, that's what I'm referring to, is not collapsing back to majority rule or consensus building or fall back to even autocracy, which now start to sound like the decision-making models that I was describing in the immature DAO space. Voting your tokens, it's a really bad way to decide, mostly. There may be some business cases where that kind of makes sense. But generally, that's not a good way to decide. Can you imagine? Well, we don't have to imagine. You have founder-run organizations where the founder has the majority of the stock and rules the roost, right? It's a horrible way to build and scale a business when you have a stockholder, a shareholder, influencing the decisions like that. And it doesn't self-organize at all. So we now rely on new, more sophisticated, modern decision-making methods. And I just pointed out holacracy's integrated decision-making as an example. There are others to make better decisions at scale. And then finally, to answer the question, the work now is to embed those rules into the smart contracts that live on blockchain and allow everybody to participate in smart contracts that are even smarter than they are today.
Okay, thank you. So let's go to another question here. One question, just a second. Okay, this is about the technology parts. Do you see a middle way, the DAO technology and concepts being used in traditional companies with more traditional liability structures?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. I love that question. We actually have a prospective client of Encodes that is a well-established organization with 400 and some employees. They're practicing holacracy. They have been for a while. And they are really interested in this space. And they're asking themselves that same question. Do we have to completely switch over? That seems impractical and risky, and there's a lot that we don't know. Could we seed some experiments within the organization as a DAO running inside the organization? I think that's a fascinating question, and I'm really intrigued to live into that answer. I don't claim I know. I think it's worth the experiment, though. We could take a functional group, a department, or even a team, to use a lot of terms that I don't like at all and rarely use, but we are talking about conventional organizations. We could take some of those segments by whatever name and distill out a purpose, right? Seed that purpose into a decentralized autonomous organization structure and begin to play the game to express that purpose into the world. Now, this, again, for folks that have deployed holacracy, will sound very similar to how holacracy is sometimes scaled in large organizations. You don't do it wholesale. You do it in pieces and parts. You kind of roll it out. And as you're rolling it out, the old power structure has to honor and protect, really, the new power structure that is emerging. So the same here. If you run an experiment with a DAO, you need to get, I think, for the experiment to be successful or have a chance even to generate some good data, it needs to be insulated or protected from the broader power structures. In other words, it needs to be allowed to run. And that's the trickier part. I don't know how that would look inside an organization, but I do think it's a worthy experiment.
So I understand that whenever there's a chance to experiment this, you'll be there. But
yeah, yes, for sure. Encode would love to hear from you.
So Tom, from this point about this experimentation part, I would like to go through another question with, the past one would be a base for that. What type of organizations are DAOs for? Which types fit better and why? Your experiment.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great question. A bit imponderable in one regard because they're so emergent, right? But we have some clues. So I got a very similar question back in the day. What organizations are good candidates for self-organization, right? Because at one point that was new. And it was like a little edgy and a little risky. And is it only tech organizations, or is it only small startup organizations? Could it really be deployed for a large scale, mature organization that's been around for 15 years? These are natural questions. It's the same question set that's being applied to DAOs. What is a good organization for a DAO? And I think it's going to be, I don't have data to support this, but my experience tells me, my intuition says, it's going to be the same answer that we came to in the self-organization space. So ultimately, the way we answer that question, what organizations are ready or good candidates for self-organization? Those that are willing to surrender power and authority to a rule set. Any organization that's running with a management hierarchy, which is just about all organizations that are ready to surrender personal power. You need a personal power holder. That could be the founder, the CEO, the board, any number of combinations, willing to surrender authority, power, into a constitutional rule set. That's how the question got answered for self-organization. I think the same ubiquity, the same broad horizontal spread will be for DAOs too. Any purpose that we can seed into a decentralized autonomous organization structure that can draw to it people who are willing to surrender their personal power to a set of rules to express that purpose into the world is a good candidate. And now just think about all the purposes in the world that need that. Now we have an engine to take purposes that we care about, seed them into these DAOs, and let the game begin. And this, I think, points the picture to what organization as a thing, not a organization as something you own, but organization as a concept is to get work done, to coordinate effort. In other words, purpose is everywhere. And decentralized autonomous organizations drawing resources, tokens, talent, operational processes to express those purposes in the world. It's a very decoupled way of thinking about work and organizing. It's a it is kind of an unbundling of what we typically think of. We typically think of all this needs to be bundled all together tightly in a nice, neat organizational structure where everything's fused. And I think what we're starting to see is teasing things apart and unbundling and unpacking, and a lot more flexibility and a lot more broad definition of what organization even means. And I think DAOs, that's why I'm so excited. I think that's why DAOs can have such a huge impact on the work environment, coordinating effort to get work done in a brand new way. So I think it's all. I don't think there's necessarily a limit.
And this is what we are also experiencing as well through many events and speakers, and we participate. We see that many different types of industries have examples of these. This is what we see as well. And by the way, one question, there is one comment from Özlem saying that ready to surrender personal power. This is what you have mentioned so far. So yeah, here is my question. For a company who thinks about surrendering this personal power, what would be the best, simplest, or easiest steps to take to, penetrate this idea through the organization?
Yeah, so this is the key move. And for a truly legitimate self-organizing system to get started, it needs to have autonomy. It needs to have its own agency, right? And so the first move, just speaking from my own experience deploying holacracy, the first move to deploy a constitutional rules-based approach to management is signing a declaration, a policy, executive policy in corporate speak. It is taking the power that was held by a person, typically a CEO. A CEO's executive power over a whole lot of stuff, right? And the first move is to make that explicit, that power as held by that role or titled position is being surrendered into or ceded into a set of rules to unpack. Now, that's the easiest move, right? Is signing that agreement. The hard thing is living it, because all of a sudden it triggers all sorts of things on both sides of that equation. For power holders, leaders, and managers, there's a new thing to learn, which is letting go of your personal authority and participating with everybody else by the same set of rules to get work done, right? So it changes the game completely and pushes on people developmentally in huge ways, but transformative ways too. It's amazing to see when you're invited into this new way of getting work done and surrendering your personal power into a system that you trust to play with others to get that work done. The other side of the coin is those that have been used to or accustomed to being told what to do or directed in a lot of ways, who are not accustomed to having personal power, have to learn something new too, stepping in and taking ownership for the power that they now have. So this changes the game and promotes good leadership of your work and good followership of other people leading their work. Notice what I did not say there is people leading people or people following people. That shifts. Everybody is leading their work and following others leading their work, surrendered to a set of rules that encodes the same gameplay for everybody. And that's a lot of words, but it makes it easier. In other words, there's a game to be played and a set of explicit rules that we're all playing by. And there are even roles to help us play by these rules better over time, because we always forget. So it allows us to play a game of shifted power without having to hold all the craziness in our head. We just do, we just practice, as we say. So the practice allows us to get more comfortable over time with surrendering our personal power or taking our personal power, depending on which side of that coin you were on prior to the shift. But it is hard. It is the seminal move. It's where the value is, quite frankly.
Thank you very much, Tom. There is one question about the PowerShiftDAO toolset. Can you provide some, insight about that?
A little bit. So basically, it's mature agreements. So the tool set relies on good, sophisticated even agreements, like an operating agreement, for example, that changes the way the legal structure works. So the good news is ENCODE has 7 years of rewriting these rules and living into them, and has very mature ways of shifting power in the legal structure, in the capital structure, in the decision-making structure. And so this becomes part of the tool set. You rely on very sophisticated rules that have been totally shifted to embrace these self-organization or power-shifted principles. And then we also rely on an explicit organizational operating system for the operational part of getting work done, like the Holacracy Constitution. That's part of the tool set. And then the place where we often overlook is the people, the cultural rule set, the cultural norms, the behavior norms, the agreement that we all abide by in the association of folks that are hanging out together to do this work together. So there are 3 agreements. These are the tool sets. There's an agreement of association for the people. There's an agreement of coordination for operations. And there's agreement of legitimacy, if you will, anchoring in a jurisdiction for legal anchoring capital structures, liability structures, and so on. Now, that's the baseline. Nobody's interested in those, by the way. Those are, it's like looking at inside your favorite game. If you looked inside and peeked inside the code that makes your favorite game work, you would be totally uninterested in that code. It's kind of like the same thing. So what ENCODE is doing then is bringing that up so that we can make playing the game a lot more engaging, even fun. And so we're working on the tool set. What's the smart contract? What's the interface to that smart contract? GlassFrog is an interesting tool set that Holacracy 1 brings to the world. There are others too, to make it fun to play the game of coordinating work effort and looking at different tools and practices in the cultural and behavior space. So there's this foundational layer, and then there are tools that make it fun, if you will, to practice.
Thank you, Tom. I think we have almost gone through the questions at the moment. But if there are other things, I think people can reach you on LinkedIn or some other medium and talk.
Yeah. Yep, LinkedIn is certainly the best social place to find me. Tom, my first name, @encode.org. I can be reached there too. Feel free to reach out and sign up to follow ENCODE's work as well. And if you're interested in self-organization, for-purpose enterprise, all the things we talked about, you can book a free discovery call there and connect up with one of our other partners and talk to you more about your needs and what's on your mind. So happy to connect in any of those ways.
Yeah, so before closing, I have one last question. So we are here in another geography, far from US, but this is global. So you have been traveling to these geographies, as you have mentioned so far. So about the companies in, Eastern Europe or Middle East or, this geography, what's your experience and what would your last words for the companies who are interested in, going into this journey?
Yeah, that's a great one. For me, being kind of a global nomad, I've had the privilege of dipping my toes into different cultures, different ways of thinking about work and different ways of relating to that work. Without exception, every place I go, there's this hunger for innovation, hunger to change the way we work. And this is actually what drives ENCODE. So we started with US agreements, And then we worked with Austria and Germany. We have some really cool mature agreements in the Netherlands. I've spoken in Moscow and Kyiv, actually, with folks a few years ago, hungry for new ways of self-organizing. This is a common thing amongst folks like us. And so the work is just to anchor the drive to innovate in these structures, to make it more explicit, more legitimate, embrace these principles. And so I think this is just a movement sweeping the planet. Decentralization and agency and purpose, unstoppable anywhere. So that's my take anyway.
Thank you very much, Tom. I also would like to thank everyone who participated this event. I think, Tom, it has been a pleasure for us to host you as a very experienced person on this, topics. I hope that someday we are going to meet also face-to-face in Istanbul as well.
I would love that. Yes. Thank you so much for the hospitality and invitation. It was a pleasure to hang out with you guys, and wonderful questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And by the way, one last message from RestartLab. Please, subscribe to our YouTube channel or reach us on LinkedIn to, follow what's about our activities. And it has been a great pleasure for everyone to host everyone here in this event with Thomison. Thank you very much one last time, and see you very soon.